who do you think is on the A list, right? It's mostly white men, because those are the people that have opened US studio movies, right? And so they would, even global stars in India don't make the A list here, but they're global stars. They have 60 million fans, and so hopefully we're starting to see people just open the aperture a little bit around what kind of talent and what counts as a star, right? I read an interview with the star of Squid Game, and someone in the US was interviewing him, asking him what it felt like to be a star. He is already a star. He's been a star in Korea for years, right? So it's just sort of the arrogance of the sort of American-centric notion that now he's become famous. He's already famous.
He used to have a time where there were anywhere from 7 to 10 intermediaries between, or maybe even more, between creator and audience, right? And now, in principle, it could be as low as 1, or and with blockchain, if it moves in that direction, which it looks like it is going to, it'll be 0 if you don't count the blockchain as a platform, right? And just a means of exchange in a way. So that's a fascinating way to look at it. You go from 12 to 5 to 1 to 0, which is really an ideal state in a way.
Hi, this is Roopak Saluja, and you're listening to Flux Navigators. I'm a producer and media entrepreneur and founder of Mumbai LA production company Bang Bang. I'm also a diplobrat, or the kid of a diplomat, and that's one of the main reasons I've had the unique opportunity to live in 13 cities in 10 countries on 6 continents. It's a major part of my identity, you could say. So I've grown up with the deep-seated belief that the world is a very small place, and I have the strong desire to make everyone else internalize that too. It's also the reason I'm somewhat of a chameleon when it comes to my English. My accent unconsciously switches depending on whom I'm talking to. Sometimes that freaks people out, but that's how it's always been since I was a little kid. But enough about me, let's move on to the show. Since that fateful day at CES 2016, when Netflix announced it was going live in 130 new countries in one shot, we've been living in a new content paradigm, one where audiences around the world are watching content created around the world, en masse. It's what I like to call the decentralization of Hollywood. Join me on Flux Navigators as I shoot the shit with creators, writers, showrunners, producers, directors, investors, media executives, and other key voices shaping this new global reality. Welcome to Flux Navigators. Before we get into today's episode, here's a disclaimer about the sound. The soundtrack on the episode is somewhat suboptimal, especially my sound. Not so much Sanjay's sound. We messed up a little bit on the settings, and it's something we've taken care of for future episodes. But you may hear that the sound's a little unclear on my end, but I can guarantee you the episode is so great, and the conversation with Sanjay is so great that you're not even going to notice it 5 minutes into the episode, so stick around.
Hello, people of the world, and welcome to this episode of Flux Navigators, where I am in conversation with my friend Sanjay Sharma, who is the founder and CEO of Marginal Media Works. Hey, good morning.
What's happening? Good evening for me. Good morning to you.
Absolutely, and here I am with my coffee. What do you got in your hand?
I'm just drinking a nice glass of water.
Okay, that's universal, all times. That's great. Thanks for hopping onto this, Sanjay. And I have to say that, we've been tinkering with the idea of going video on this for some time. And you asked yesterday if we're going to do video or audio. And we're like, that's a great sort of segue into doing both. We're not sure yet what we're going to put out there, but at least
waiting until you got Ryan Gosling on the pod. I'm flattered that you went video with me first.
Yeah, great reason to.
The Indian Ryan Gosling.
Absolutely. Do you get that a lot?
Yeah, all the
time. So you're in LA at the moment, which it's been a while. I was last there just before Thanksgiving. You and I have actually never been in the same physical space at the same time.
Correct.
But we've been on a lot of Zoom spaces at the same time. I'm looking forward to catching up in person. But until then, we're just going to have to do it like this. I'm going to get right into it. And this is a question I haven't asked anyone before on this podcast. What's your favorite Wordle opening word?
Oh, an excellent question and a very timely one, because I got my ass kicked yesterday at Wordle by both my mother and my 12-year-old. Humiliating Wordle day. So my opening word is usually adieu, ADIU. My son's is alien. I don't know what my mom does. She has her own strategy. And the word yesterday was cynic.
Oh, right. Cynic was, that was really good. I thought it was.
No spoiler, if you're listening to this podcast by now, you obviously would have missed the word. So
Yeah, exactly. So mine was, I'm in competition with my two kids who are 12 and 10, and
not a competition. It's all for fun.
and my dad and my brother. And Cynic was good. I did well on that one, but I've already done my word for today, which is your word for tomorrow, so I'm not going to talk about that.
Okay, but I haven't done today's either, so yeah.
Okay, so mine used to be adieu in the beginning, and then I haven't been doing that for some time, and I actually alternate between route or route, ROUTE, and suite, SUITE.
Ooh, nice. Okay.
These have been serving me well. Occasionally, I'll do the occasional adieu. So I realized that because it's a lot about it, it's the luck of the draw in terms of what your first guess is. So you may as well sort of keep rotating between a few of these.
My good friend and our head of film, Milan, who he's a spelling bee champ, plays into all the Asian stereotypes. His word, I don't know if he'll care if I'm sharing his secrets. It's not competitive. I think he uses cameo as his first word.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
It's funny that why it's good is because I think there's a disproportionately large number of words with C, more so than in normal life. I find that.
Right.
I don't know if that's deliberate, but anyway, there's also other variations of this game. There's Wordle backwards, however you spell it, EOR, and that makes you guess the word that was there and from the clue. So you actually get the final word and you have to guess what the clue was. That's one. And then there's another one that we started playing called Wordle, WORLDLE, which is about, you have to guess the map of a country. And so, enough about Wordle. What I'd like to know really is, what are you obsessing over right now?
Oh, what am I obsessing over right now? So hopefully we don't enter into a war with Russia over the Ukraine. I'm kind of obsessing about that. I don't think we will, but we'll see. By the time this comes out, we will know. Or we'll still be in this bizarre game of cat and mouse. But outside of geopolitics, I'm obsessing over maybe generative music NFTs. I know you've been following crypto and blockchain stuff, as have I, for now many years. And I'm very interested and very bullish on it, not unlike lots of other people. But one little type of NFT that I'm interested in is like generative art, but generative music. So I've been spending a good bit of time researching that and finding recording artists and composers and musicians and mathematicians and kind of people who play in music and computational science around doing generative music NFTs. So that's something I'm probably obsessing about.
That's fascinating.
A disproportionate amount of my time.
Thank you for putting me in the same bucket as you in terms of going deep on this stuff, because I was an absolute novice, or a nub as my kids say, and I was like, isn't it noob? It was like, oh God, you're such a nub. It's nub. No, so it's evolved, I guess. But I really went deep around Christmas over the holidays to kind of, to go from, I would say, 1 to 2 on 10. So I really don't know enough, but I know more than I did last year. But what are generative music NFTs? I know what music-related NFTs are, but what are generative music NFTs?
So it is basically the idea of the simplest analog is probably generative art. And by the way, I'm by no means the authority on this stuff either. If you're a 2, maybe I'm a 4. I'm trying to be a 7. I don't know that many people are up there. So the idea of the like super popular ones now, like Bored Ape Yacht Club, right, which is a generative art project. So you define certain characteristics, attributes, and elements that can happen, and then the code essentially creates 1,000, 10,000 individual pieces, but they're programmed, right? And so generative music is the same thing. Can you create 1,000, 10,000 sort of pieces of individual music? Each piece of music is unique, but it all stems from this original code, right? So it's randomized, but with structure around.
Right. And moving from the code layer to what you actually experience, is it almost like remixes of the same track in a way? Do they all have a common bass and sound in a way?
Yeah. So you would define sort of, certain elements that remain the same, certain elements that can change. Can you have tempo change, key change, things like that. Doing it in a way that works is really complicated, because once you start getting into so many different variables, you get things that are off key, or like things that just don't sound right. That's some of the fun of it. And then you can match them. There's people doing cool stuff. One of my kids is super into this, and so I've been getting into it with him. But there are people who match each piece of code and the music it generates with like sine waves visually, so that the idea would be that each unique NFT then is an audio visual digital object, right? So you could play it on your digital frame in your wall. You could own it. You could take a frame of it and use it as your Twitter profile. You can also listen to it. And then when you own it, then you could make music around it. It's like owning the master and sync of a song, right?
That, my friend, is fucking fascinating.
So we'll see. We'll see.
TIL about generative music NFTs. And we're going to go, a little bit later in the conversation, I'm going to come back to Web3 and the implications on the entertainment business, because I want to talk a little bit about some specific things on that. But before we do that, you know that this podcast is all about the decentralization of Hollywood. It's something that I'm obsessing over all the time. I'm obsessed with for the past couple of years. I talk about it. I write about it. It's sort of our underlying theme and one of the pillars on which we're building Bang Bang as a global studio between Bombay and LA. And I want to ask you, though, what does that mean to you? What is, when I say the decentralization of Hollywood, what does it mean to you, if anything?
I think what it means to me, and I think we're probably like-minded on this, because it said in a slightly different way, is exactly kind of one of the founding elements or pillars for Marginal. It was this idea that you have, for the first time, the world's first global television networks, global radio stations, global audio storytelling platforms. So Netflix, Amazon, Apple, HBO Max, Audible, Amazon Music, Spotify. These are all global platforms, right? And the global market is a very interesting and different dynamic than the historical filmed entertainment market, which was very fragmented and siloed and windowed and stuff like that, right? And so to me, the beauty of what's happening in this world is, when you look at, from my tech background, and your tech listeners will often think of problems in terms of product market fit. And I often look at entertainment in terms of product market fit, right? And so if your target market isn't the US studio theatrical market, but rather the global streaming market for filmed entertainment, or for music, or for audio storytelling, the global market is 87% not white. Probably 60+% is Asian, African, and diaspora. And so the idea that the majority of the world's filmed entertainment, or what we have historically considered premium filmed entertainment, is created by or through this small club of probably 300 people that are in Hollywood, and that are the intermediaries, gatekeepers, and decision makers for most of the premium filmed entertainment, certainly made in this country, right? And the largest export, one of the largest exports of this country around the world, right? So you start to see, why would that work? No one would think that makes any sense at all, right? And so companies like Netflix, obviously have been ahead of this, with massive local language operations around the world, and we've seen it kind of come to fruition in the most acute way, with suddenly Squid Game is the biggest show in the history of television, right? That could never have been imagined even a year ago. I think most people in Hollywood probably still wouldn't have believed it was possible today. No one would have ever greenlit that show. That's not a show that ever could have been conceived to be a global breakout hit, right? And that's not the only example. It's certainly the biggest one. But that's been happening for some time. The Netflix series Dark, the German series, friends at Netflix told me some time ago, I'm not sure if this is accurate or not, but I think it was accurate, that at the time it was also the most popular show in India, right? And no one would have thought that a German sci-fi series would be the biggest show on Netflix in India, right? Narcos, Money Heist, Lupin, right? And so all of these things are challenging the conventional wisdom of Hollywood, where, a black French man could not star in a global hit. Really? Well, he just did, right? A Korean cast with an Indian Korean, right, could never carry a global hit. Well, it just became the biggest show in the history of the world, right? So all of these preconceived notions are possible because this is now getting increasingly decentralized by force, right? Because consumers are drivers of it rather than the gatekeepers.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That's a really nice sort of explanation of it. A couple of things on that. Number one is that Dark was, as you say, the number one show in India until Sacred Games came about. And this I have on confirmation from someone at Netflix. I think that, this whole sort of the Squid Game phenomenon is a nice shortcut. People like you and me now have a simplified way to just say, okay, the Squid Game phenomenon, but we were already talking about it for a while before that, which is really, again, in a simple way to say great stories can come from anywhere and find audiences everywhere. And the fact that it really is, it's something like Squid Game could never have existed a few years ago. Just the real Koreanness of it and how that resonated globally based on some basic human nature type insights. And then, even as you say, as an add-on, this Indian Korean dude who's playing a Pakistani immigrant, and it's just bizarre. If someone were to time machine their way into this from, say, 1995, they would, it would be pure fiction to them, or sci-fi.
Even from 5 years ago, it probably.
5 years ago, yeah.
One of our kind of core DNA in the company is that creativity is equally distributed around the world. But access and opportunity are not, right? And so I'm a Korean film nerd, has a very rich cinematic history and tradition of writer-director auteurs, essentially, right? And people know that's not a secret. That's been known, right? Old Boy was remade by Spike Lee. The Japanese film The Ringu became the Ring franchise. Like, we've known it for a very long time, right? But it wasn't until Parasite that people start to get like, oh, it can work as it is in Korean language, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Old Boy was also made by Sanjay Gupta here in Bollywood as Zinda with Sanjay. As they say, frame to frame copy.
Framed. I think that's the exciting aspect of what's happening right now with this sort of tectonic plate shift, certainly in Hollywood, but I think in the traditional entertainment business around the world, is you're seeing the potential for more power to be placed in the hands of creators on the one hand and consumers on the other hand, right? Audiences, community, right? Rather than the intermediaries being the source of power, right? And that's the hope. And ultimately, we'll get to the blockchain and Web3, which has a lot to do with that as well. But even if you were not thinking 10 years out, 20 years out, the current moment in time hopefully is ushering in this sea change where studios, streamers are starting to say, oh, okay, we need to expand our view of what we greenlight, what counts as A-list actors, right? Because the historical data that we use is contaminated, right? We take out projects and say, oh, it's great, but bring back an A-list actor. Who do you think is on the A-list, right? It's mostly white men because those are the people that have opened U.S. studio movies, right? And so they would, even global stars in India don't make the A-list here, but they're global stars. They have 60 million fans, and so hopefully we're starting to see people just open the aperture a little bit around what kind of talent and what counts as a star, right? I read an interview with the star of Squid Game, and someone in the U.S. was interviewing him, asking him what it felt like to be a star. He is already a star. He's been a star in Korea for years, right? So it's just sort of the arrogance of the sort of American centric notion that now he's become famous. He's already famous.
It's funny that you say that, because just a few days ago, we were talking about it. So my wife Tara and I were having a conversation with the kids about one of them asked, who is more famous, Priyanka Chopra or Amitabh Bachchan? And it was a weird question because obviously it's Amitabh Bachchan, but then I was like, okay, it depends, right? And then my wife and I were sort of debating this. I said, look, just in terms of, let's look at it like this. Everyone in India knows Amitabh Bachchan, and almost everyone in India, maybe just a little bit less, knows Priyanka Chopra. But of the 280 to 300 million Americans, many more know Priyanka Chopra than Amitabh Bachchan, right? So maybe in those numbers, Priyanka Chopra might be better known in terms of number of people. And then the question was, who has a higher Instagram follower count? So I was like, okay, I don't know, I haven't checked that. But yeah, it brings up interesting questions about what is fame, and is it defined by number of people or range or width or breadth, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that you said, which is really interesting, if you just think about it in absolute simplicity, which is you used to have a time where there were anywhere from 7 to 10 intermediaries between, or maybe even more, between creator and audience, right? And now, in principle, it could be as low as one, or and with blockchain, if it moves in that direction, which it looks like it is going to, it'll be zero if you don't count the blockchain as a platform, right? And just a means of exchange in a way. So that's a fascinating way to look at it. You go from 12 to 5 to 1 to 0, which is really an ideal state in a way, if you look at it from some lens. But you were talking about the globality of all of this. What about your background? I know you grew up in Louisiana. Were you born there, so tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I was born in India. So I was born in Lucknow, and we moved. My family are from kind of gaons in MP and UP. So my dad ran away from home when he was a kid. He kind of moved here to there, and eventually became a professor in Lucknow. So that's where I was born. My sister and I were both born there. And then we immigrated to the States in the late 70s. I was still a kid. But so, yeah, I grew up, your good memory. I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, of all places.
It's the capital. Yeah.
Capital city. Yeah. Yeah.
Bobby.
I know that. So I do know Bobby. So it's funny whenever people, they're like, oh, do you know Bobby Jindal? And I usually say, that's a racist question. You shouldn't ask that question. Right?
But I can.
You can because you're brown, but and then they're like, oh, it gets people off guard. Like, oh, you think just because I'm an Indian guy from Baton Rouge that I know Bobby? And then they're taken aback. And then of course I say, yeah, I do. We did grow up on the same street, and our families are very good friends. So then they say, so I was right. Well, you were right, but you shouldn't have asked the question, right?
That's funny. So what was it like, growing up apart from you and Bobby, were there a lot of other brown kids growing up?
No, it's very different now. It's night and day now. It's a pretty diverse place. It's major kind of shipping portal city on the Mississippi River. It's got a massive chemical industry and complex there. So Chevron and Exxon and all those guys have big plants and refineries there. But for us, it was a university. It has LSU is the State University of Louisiana, and its flagship campus is in Baton Rouge, and it's the seat of government, obviously. So it's a more cosmopolitan city in some ways than I think people would think. Now it's an incredibly diverse city with a lot of vibrant kind of immigrant communities there. When we moved there, there were not a ton of brown folks there. So it was an odd scene growing up, kind of in between cultures. Was still a pretty segregated city. And I didn't particularly love it growing up. There was a lot of things I did like about it. And luckily my parents are also both Marxists. And so I was raised very left of center, as a socialist or a Marxist, mostly. The good thing about that, so that made us even more weird, because there weren't many Indians there. There were no Marxists there. Right. But the thing it did give me was non-traditional South Asian parents. Right. I mean, they did not push me to study computer science or to be an engineer or a doctor or anything like that. And so I grew up, skateboarding, listening to heavy metal and hip hop and singing in rock bands and, kind of just doing regular kid shit. And it was cool. There was a small but good scene of like-minded folks that you could kind of get in with at our public high school. And we lived, fairly close to the university. It ends up being a little more progressive as like university campuses end up being. So there was good record stores and good, like stuff like that, like you would find in a college town. So grew up in Baton Rouge and stayed there until I was 18 to go to college in New York City, where I'd never been to New York in my life and had not visited the college. So showed up there, but still love Louisiana and still love Baton Rouge. My folks still live there, and we end up there. I mean, COVID aside, and in general, would go there once a year.
And what did New York City do for you?
So New York, changed my life. So I wanted to be a writer director. And I had applied to, a bunch of fancy schools. My high school guidance counselor had told me not to apply to any schools because most people from where I grew up didn't get in or didn't go, right? And so I got into, I was fortunate enough to get into a bunch of schools. I didn't know that much about them, and this is pre-internet, so you couldn't Google all this stuff. But I did know that Columbia was in New York City. And I knew that that was the heart of indie filmmaking and the heart of hip hop. And so to me, that was basically what motivated me. And that was basically the decision matrix was just get to New York. Right. And so New York changed my life. I mean, Columbia changed my life. I feel like I learned how to read in college. It kicked my ass. You're going to school with people who have, gone to private schools and boarding schools and are reading, the Odyssey for the fifth time, and many of whom have read it in Greek. And I was like, what? So it definitely was difficult. But, once I got kind of the hang of it, it was really eye-opening and world-changing. So spent my, day, I worked usually 2 jobs. I studied a lot because I had to catch up a lot. I worked on student films pretty much every free moment I got. And occasionally I'd go to a jazz club. and it was the best. It was the best thing in the world. Yeah.
The jazz is in your blood, Louisiana all the way.
My first job was actually I was a jazz DJ in Baton Rouge.
Oh, really?
Public radio station. Yeah. So.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's fascinating. I had no idea. And when did you go to law school? Did you go to law school in New York as well?
No. So so after college, I moved. I had planned to go into film, decided not to for a variety of reasons. Partly chickened out, partly thought even if I was any good, I didn't see a path to entering the film business. We didn't, don't know anybody, have no connections. don't know how to get movies financed, don't know any managers or lawyers or anyone. I just thought this is probably not it's probably not possible, right? Weren't a ton of people of color in the film program. Most people who were getting their short movies financed were, when you really probed deeply as to how they were doing it, you'd find the answer was they asked their family for the money, right? And so I sort of paused and said, look, my parents grew up with no water or electricity in rural India. And in one generation, here you are. So I felt like I could not fuck that up, right? And so I paused film, thought maybe if I'm lucky, maybe I'll return to it, or maybe my kids will have the luxury of pursuing a career in the arts, right? But it's probably not in the cards for me. I love politics and also studied history at Columbia and grew up in a very radical kind of progressive household. So I moved to DC after college, worked in the Clinton administration for the Attorney General at the Justice Department. The Attorney General was an amazing leader, a woman named Janet Reno, who was first female Attorney General and longest serving Attorney General. Worked directly with her on a task force investigating the president. So, top secret kind of security clearance. And as a 22-year-old, I'm working with an FBI task force and a team of some of the highest octane DOJ attorneys around, and it was fucking great. It was like amazing. So that kind of got me thinking, okay, law is cool. Law can be an agent of social change, and I can apply to schools and either get in or not get in, but I don't need a network, or I don't need anyone to make a phone call, or I don't need personal connections, right? And so I did. So then that's when I got into and moved out to California to go to Stanford. That's where I went to law school. That is also kind of transformative in a lot of ways. Partly because it's an amazing just law school. It's an amazing school in general, but also the time I was there, which sounds like 100 years ago now, was 97 to 2000 is basically the birth of the commercial internet. And so I just nerded out on the internet. Yahoo had just started in Palo Alto, and Google had just started, right? And so I just went deep into web indexing and crawling, peer-to-peer file sharing, essentially early decentralization, right? I mean, the internet is a decentralized platform originally, right? And so I just loved that. But yeah, and then I moved to LA after that. I did another year of government service, clerking on the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit here. You have an international audience that may not know. The Court of Appeals sits below the Supreme Court. The Ninth Circuit is the geographical territory that the courts are broken down in. It's the largest circuit. It covers essentially the entire Western United States. Importantly, that includes Silicon Valley, Hollywood, kind of the new powers, in my view, for this shifting balance from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And that's also the year the court sat on the Napster case, which I used and was obsessed with, right? And so I had this idea that what technology was doing to the internet, what technology and the internet was doing to the music business would in turn happen to the film to entertainment business, and that quite selfishly, maybe that was my way into the movies. So that's kind of how I wove my way back to the movie business. Very circuitous path. I wouldn't recommend others to do it. You could shortcut that by several years and hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt.
But you know what? As you were explaining this, the one word that kept going through my mind was circuitous. And I think that, you could have probably taken a straighter path to it, but you wouldn't have had the experience and been the guy you are today, and the reason I asked you about law school is because I'm always fascinated being in a room with a lawyer producer, right? Because the way, and I've been in the room now, virtual room with you on a number of calls, and just, the way you think about things is very different. And now it's starting to be on that list for me, which is the regrets in my life. I never ever had any aspirations to go to law school or be a lawyer ever until more recently. So the first one is that I never learned to play the piano. And I always asked my mom, because she was learning when I was made to learn to play the tabla, which I really love and really gave me a sense of rhythm and also led to me eventually being a DJ, et cetera, et cetera. But I really wish I'd learned to play the piano. But that's a regret. Do you play any instrument?
I wish. And it's a current conversation in our house because we're making our youngest stick with the piano.
Good reason. Our older one is on the piano and our younger one is on the drum. And I always say, look, my dad started to learn to play the piano at 55. But then he gave up at 56. But anyway, but I think that's one. And now the other one is starting to be that I don't have legal training because, as I was saying, I mean, there was a call that we did about a potential project that we might work on together. And, there were different ways to approach this from a legal angle because it involved some rights. And so you broke down, and I was hemming and hawing about like, okay, we could do this. And then, perhaps, and then you just broke down like 3 scenarios. A, we could do this. B, we could do this. C, we could do this with a fair amount and enough, but not too much detail behind each from a legal perspective. And I was like, shit, man, how do you do that? You just saved us hours on the phone with our lawyer, et cetera, right? So it's such
I'll send you the bill. That's perfect. Yeah. I'll discount whatever you're.
and as I say, because there's so much stuff to do with rights and legality and all that, especially with the kind of stuff that we're interested in doing. And, even if it's pure fiction and IP, it's always a question. So it really does help. And how do you look at that? Because I'm sure you look back at it and go, well, hey, that was good, even though I took this path and I could have gone straight, but it did definitely serve you well, right?
I think so. I mean, look, I did like it. I mean, I'm a nerd, so I kind of loved law school. There's people who hate it, and I understand why. I discourage people from doing it sometimes. I get asked a lot, like, should I do law school? And, it's like, it kind of depends on what you want to do after that, right? And I think a lot of people go to law school because it's one of those training grounds that you sort of hear you can do anything with a law degree, right? And I think that's true and not true, right? It's true in a sense. I mean, you can do anything with a medical degree. You could get a medical degree and go do something else too. You can do anything with any degree, right? So it's not as simple as you could do anything with it, because the truth is most people who get a law degree become lawyers, right? And then once you start practicing law for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, it's hard to do anything else, right? And so it's not an easy track to get off of. So unless you want to be a lawyer, in which case, obviously go for it. If there's something that's sort of adjacent to it and you have a clear vision or plan for how this ties into it, some esoteric area of academic study, or, you want to go into politics or government, or, there's something that that this type of training and education will be useful for, it can work. But a lot of times people go into it just thinking, well, I'll do this because I don't know what else to do, right? And those are the ones where it's like, save 3 years and a lot of money, right?
Yeah. But, there's a reason that but a lot of agents are trained lawyers. If you look at other organizations, I've worked with the NBA in a very close capacity a few years ago as an NBA partner, and the company is run by lawyers. I mean, the top 5 people in the company are all lawyers, right? So
yes. There was definitely a time here even where most of the major label record heads were former lawyers, like studio heads were former. It's definitely historically true. I feel like you see that less and less. Feels like it's more of a specialty, and maybe it can translate into a business function. But it's anyway. Look, I liked it. I don't regret it. I kind of jokingly say I wish I hadn't done it, but I loved it, and I I loved the school, and I loved the people and the teacher. I mean, it was amazing education. The thinking, like the kind of training ground for how to just like analyze issues, it is actually very helpful, right? And so, like what you were talking about, we can sit down and evaluate a project creatively, and then we can get to the business of the project and how complex or simple will it be pretty quickly. And so, I gotta believe part of that is just 15 years of experience, but that experience started with a kind of fundamental training ground in how to assess issues and risk and opportunities, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm dying to get into Marginal, but before I do that, I want to talk about two parts of your career trajectory that are particularly fascinating for me. One is your time at Machinima, and that followed by, and I may be even going chronologically, Machinima and then All Def Digital. And yeah, so you want to talk about that?
Sure,
Machinima, yeah. And before that, I mean, Machinima is so iconic in that MCN era as being one of the big success. It was acquired by Warner, right?
Yep, that's right. That's right. So from I started my career at Warner Brothers. It started actually at a law firm where I built this like entertainment practice that focused on technology. And that was not really a thing. So it's probably the first, or certainly one of the first such practices in the country at the time, part of a big global law firm. And all, within a year, like we represented every major movie studio. Warner Brothers very quickly became my single biggest client. And then I very quickly got pulled in-house to Warner. So that's where I started my career. And it was fantastic. It's an amazing studio. And worked on the big, the Matrix movies, the Chris Nolan Batman movies, the Ocean's movies, kind of the big global franchises. Since they had been an outside client, I had the kind of a unique purview across the studio because I had done work with and continue to do work with the global anti-piracy team, the tech ops team, the video games team, consumer products, international TV distribution. So while I was housed in the feature films business affairs team, I kind of worked across the studio and really saw the plumbing of how a major studio works, right? Across, its sexiest divisions, but also some of these other divisions that people don't really think about, like international TV distribution, right? So it was super interesting. After a few years, I sort of hit a wall and thought, it's not, it's a big company. I was the youngest guy by several years. And, you start to feel like, so is this going to be it? I'm going to be a lawyer at a movie studio. Right. And I didn't like it. I would fall asleep at work a lot. I was just sort of like, this can't be it for me. Right. I sometimes wish I had not felt that way, because obviously it's a fantastic career and they're a great employer. And I'd probably have a meaningful 401k by now if I'd stayed there. But I just thought I got to do something different and something a little more entrepreneurial. So I left. I stopped practicing law like formally, and I sort of took the low man on the totem pole job at a tech startup, like a pure ad tech, video ad tech startup, as like junior biz dev guy, right? And so did that for several years. That was essentially my MBA in practice. Amazing ride. Company had meteoric rise and then kind of a cataclysmic kind of demise, but amazing experience, amazing groups of people in and out of the company. And then after that is when, with a couple of other folks, helped start Machinima. So Machinima is the first MCN, right? There might have been a couple of smaller ones, but for all practical purposes, was one of, if not the first company to create this model called the multi-channel network. We wrote literally the first agreements to take, hey, you have this gaming channel, why don't you put it into our network, right? And so we, for better or worse, we created that model and scaled, I think, one of the, the biggest brands in that ecosystem. And certainly for people of a certain age range who were interested in video games, it's still on Zoom sometimes where people are like, whoa, you were at Machinima, or they'll see, I was on a Zoom with someone the other day, and they had a Machinima poster, believe it or not, in like the back of their like the room that they were in. And I was just like, wow. And it was, it's a giant gamer. It's like this young woman who's a giant gamer and just loved the brand. So, so it was cool. Yeah. So it was a fun ride, building company to be, a few hundred people, raised a ton of venture capital from the Valley and from Google Capital, and eventually sold it to Warner Brothers. So, it was quickly probably the biggest media property on YouTube. And certainly the biggest in the category. So, yeah.
Wow, and that spawned a whole sort of MC.
How have you heard of that? That's the question.
Well, I was honestly, I did try in another avatar to build an MCN, and I think we got into it a little bit late, and so I was coming to LA to, dip in and out of conferences and stuff around 2014. Maker had just happened. The acquisition had just happened. So it was like, okay, this is great. And, and then there was Awesomeness TV and what was, so, there were all of these, there was, what's the
Full
one?
screen.
Full screen, of course. And then what was the Style
Hall.
Style Hall, yeah, which eventually... Yeah, and I think eventually led up to Bertelsmann owning it in some form. And so, there was all of that. And in India, there were a couple of people already doing it, and we realized very quickly, we got into it, and we realized that we were a little bit late to the game, and then we pivoted. And then anyway, that company didn't end up working out, and a lot of learnings from there. But I was really inside this world, and so I definitely knew Machinima. I've never been there, but I remember walking. Where was the office? Wasn't it in West Hollywood?
West Hollywood on Santa Monica by Barney's Beanery.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly. I remember walking by it late at night, walking out of a bar or something, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure. But
that could very well be. Yeah, that's right. It's our worldwide headquarters, which is now the office of my friend Greg Silverman's company, Stampede Ventures.
Oh, is Stampede there?
Yeah, Greg ran Warner Brothers, but he was when I was a young guy there, he was a young up and coming, whip smart creative exec. So.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, I know Stampede very well. We've talked to them on a number of things, but I didn't know they were there because no one's really anywhere right now. So, and then tell us about All Def Digital.
So then after we sold Machinima to Warner Brothers, I took some time off, and then actually tried to start Marginal at that time, and abysmal failure. So couldn't get interest in it. No one really bought the thesis. I was, it's you said your effort at an MCN was too late. What's the saying? It's, being too early is just as bad as being too late. Machinima was very early, so a lot of arrows in our back. And it was definitely too early for Marginal, right? The idea of, Netflix running away with the ball and everyone pivoting to streaming, which is that was sort of the pitch, is that everything is going streaming. People were still very much like, no, that's unlikely to happen, right? A lot of people thought Netflix would fail even then, right? And then the idea of what we'd call multicultural or diverse content having any value at all, much less outsized value, which is what I believe, was just like no one was buying it. People are like, it's niche, it's too small, it just won't be anything material. So anyway, could not get that going, and through random series of events got introduced to Russell Simmons, founder of Def Jam Records. And as you and I have talked about as childhood fans of hip hop, I hadn't met Russell before, but I obviously knew who he was, and was the guy.
Were you fanboying?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he wrote the blueprint, as far as I was concerned, for and entrepreneurship, right? And hip hop as entrepreneurship, right? So the sort of lessons and values of hip hop being sort of, art speaking truth to power, but culture that existed through music, but also through fashion, through streetwear, through all these other kind of elements, right? And Russell aside from Def Jam, then created Fat Farm, the first streetwear brand, and then Def Comedy Jam, Def Poetry Jam, and sort of all the launched certainly many of the most well-known recording artists, comedians, and talent that and poets that we've seen, right? So anyway, so I knew he was. I had never met him, but I grew up with a lot of Def Jam records on vinyl, right? And so he and I met. He was trying to start a new company. He'd been interested in acquiring a TV network. And this is the story that he told me. I don't know if it's true or not. But that he had met, I think he had met Eric Schmidt at a yacht in St. Bart's or something like that. Says he's planning to buy a TV network. I don't know if this is true or not at all, by the way.
Eric Schmidt, for our listeners, used to run Google for a long time.
Right. And Eric says, why would you buy a TV network? No one watches television, right? Russell, has two daughters, and was very astute with kind of consumer trends and behaviors, right? And notice that's true. They're kind of always glued to their phone, and they're always watching this thing called YouTube. And so the pitch to him was you should start something like the Machinima for hip hop, right? And he, of course, had no idea what Machinima was, couldn't pronounce the name of the company, didn't know anything or care about video games. But was like, okay, this is interesting, right? And so we started All Def based on obviously the Def Jam record label and the Def brand, and became a pretty meaningful digital media property for several years. Very quickly became bigger in online video than Vice, than Complex, because those were all print publications moving, or print to digital, but moving into video, and we were kind of video native, right?
Right. What year are we talking?
This would have been, good question. So it's 2022, 2020. This would have been 2015, 16, 17. Yeah, somewhere right around there. So not that long ago. With COVID now, it's like basically a decade ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
It feels like a world ago, but anyway, yeah. So All Def was a very simple pitch. It was like hip hop's answer to Vice. It was it was hip hop as a digital MCN or a short form video network, and then taking that content and then laddering it up into film and television. So we had a first look deal with HBO, and we started to make shows for Comedy Central and MTV, and started to develop movies. And then about a little over 3 years ago, I decided to leave and take another run at Marginal, because in the time that we had begun and started All Def, that 3-year period, it wasn't that long actually. It was I think literally about 3 years, maybe a little less. The market had just changed so dramatically.
And that's it for part 1 of my conversation with Sanjay Sharma. You're going to have to tune in to next week's episode of Flux Navigators to listen to Sanjay talk about Marginal Media, the story behind it, why they exist, why he's doing what he's doing. And then we talk a lot more about blockchain and its implications along with Web3 for the entertainment universe. So catch you on the other side.
Apple, eBay, are you crazy jumping into the streaming business? Like, what are you smoking, right? And so 2 out of 3, eBay still never launched a premium programming initiative, but obviously Apple and Amazon did, right? And the cultural thesis that we as people of color or others of all kinds, right, that fringe cultures, subcultures, international cultures, diaspora cultures are the creators of cool.